welcome. You are listening to the Theology Mill from Whitfinstock Publishers. My name is Zach Mickle, and I work here at Whitfinstock. I'm also the host of this podcast, which, as you know, consists of interviews with some of the leading authors in theology, biblical studies, and philosophy. If you like what you hear on the podcast, come stop by our website at whitfinstock.com. That's WIPF and stock, STOCK.com. So in this standalone episode, I get to interview Dr. Presian Renee Burroughs. Dr. Burroughs earned her doctorate at Duke Divinity School and currently teaches at the Wake Forest University School of Divinity. And she's also a fellow of the Center for Energy, Environment, and Sustainability there at Wake Forest. And most important to us, she's the author of a recent book entitled Creation, Slavery, and Liberation, Paul's Letter to Rome in the Face of Imperial and Industrial Agriculture. She's also the editor of Practicing with Paul, Reflections on Paul and the Practices of Ministry in honor of Susan G. Eastman. And both of those books were published with us at Cascade. So without further ado, friends, let's head over to the interview. Well, I am here with Dr. Presian Burroughs, who has published a couple books with us. One that she edited, which is, what's called Practicing with Paul. Is that right?
That's right.
And then she recently published Creation's Slavery and Liberation on Romans, which is really, I got the chance to read a few chapters from it in preparation for the interview. It was really, really fascinating stuff. And we are sharing a drink. By the way, where are you located?
I'm in Winston-Salem, North Carolina.
Okay. Okay. We've had a few North Carolinians.
That's right.
Okay. Wow. I can't believe I got that right. So we are sharing a drink from Oregon to North Carolina. I have a couple drinks. We're recording this during Lent, so I'm very, anti, not deliberately, but accidentally being sort of anti-Lenten with my drinking this morning. But so I have a coffee and an orange juice. So I'm a happy glutton this morning. But what are you drinking?
Well, I have water and a chai, like a chai latte.
Oh, nice. Lovely. Nice. Very cool. Okay. So tell me a bit about your the early years of your theological journey and how you found yourself at Duke Divinity.
All right. Well, I have to kind of go far back, but I became a follower of Christ in high school through friendships with people who were Christians. And during that time and for quite a few years after that, I was participating in a segment of Christianity that I would today call pretty narrowly evangelical and fundamentalist. And I loved my church friends. I was always wanting to know more and was willing to ask hard questions. And when I did a master's degree in linguistics, I started to recognize that knowledge, theological knowledge, as well as even scientific knowledge, was shaped by our perspectives, at least to some degree, our subjectivity. And that as humans, there's no way for us to remove ourselves from the process of discovery and interpretation. And this is not to say that there's not truth, but that I think for me, I came to realize we humans can't fully know it and translate it and capture it and control it. So when I started applying this to understanding the Bible, I began realizing that things weren't as clearly defined as I once thought and was taught by my Christian tradition. I came to realize that the Bible didn't just drop out of heaven, written from start to finish in English and ready for us to just memorize and apply. I started realizing that God led many different people in various times and locations to use their minds and their experiences of God to narrate their their view of God and God's world, and that
Hmm.
God continues to guide us through that process of knowing God through our interpretive faculties. So, along with this growing sense that I shouldn't just approach the Bible as if it were this scientific treatise with these clearly defined fundamentals, one might say, I began sort of realizing that faithful Christians throughout the ages had also been holding pretty different views of scripture and theology, and that my narrower Christian tradition was was narrower than it needed to be. So I started to gain a greater sense of freedom to move towards a broader evangelicalism, and in this process became aware of Duke Divinity School, and particularly the work of Richard Hayes. And at the time when I applied for a master's degree, MTS at Duke, I knew I wanted to go on for doctoral work in New Testament and probably Paul. And Richard Hayes's presence at Duke Divinity was like the big lure.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so that's kind of what led me there. Um, yeah. So I
Yeah.
started as an MTS student, but then turned to MDiv, and then
Okay.
after a few years did entered again as a THD student.
Yeah. Yeah. Richard Hayes is a good reason to go anywhere, probably. Yeah. One of my like a follow up question, I guess, would be as you're as you sort of transition from what you described as like a narrow evangelicalism to kind of a broader evangelicalism, did that change your ideas about sort of the inspiration of scripture? Like were those kind of shaped anew in any ways?
Yeah, it took a very long time, and honestly, I still wrestle with that, and
Yeah.
it's uh, yeah, it's very challenging to work through because uh, when I'm thinking through it rationally and not just reacting emotionally, I think, in many ways, I I placed my faith in the Bible and a particular interpretation of the Bible
Hmm.
rather than the living God who stood beyond the Bible,
Hmm.
and yet would be communicated through the scriptures as well. But um, and so that process of developing a different hermeneutic, of seeing scripture in a different way, it often brought with it a sense of guilt
Hmm.
because it could easily feel like I was turning my back on God because I was turning my back on certain fundamental beliefs. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's yeah. I've probably followed a similar trajectory. And yeah, it is you sort of exposing yourself. Like it can be kind of a fearsome thing. So that's
Mhm.
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so you went to Duke primarily because you wanted to study with Richard Hayes. But what was your experience like at the Div school there? How did it sort of shape you as a theologian and as a person? I mean, obviously, you said you went there for Richard Hayes. Were there other kind of faculty or peers, other students who really left a deep impression on you?
Mhm. Well, so like I've already kind of indicated, the time at Duke definitely, I mean, it was exciting and very good, but there was also some unsettling aspects to it. As seminarians, we face the complexities and uncertainties involved in theological knowledge. And then with that, also the horrifying histories
Hmm.
that Christians and the church have been involved in, the failures of God's people to live as God calls us to live, now and in the past, and all of that um, is part of what one wrestles with through seminary. And
Yeah.
and so it pressed me to critique my faith, my practice, and really my whole life. So so that was it was a challenge. Along with that, though, as a master's student who was trying to pursue further doctoral work, and the competitiveness of that, I had to face my inadequacies and push through them, and to the best of my ability to shore those inadequacies up. And this was also very difficult, grueling work, and humbling, humiliating sometimes work. And it probably really wasn't until my doctoral years that I developed close relationships with my professors, um, and started to see that they too had experiences of inadequacy and of feeling
Hmm.
like they didn't know enough and those sorts of things. And definitely my relationships with other doctoral students allowed me to see that my peers struggled with those same feelings. Um,
Yeah.
and just the blessing of being able to walk with peers as we all wrestled with our faith and the history of the church and all of that. It was a really beautiful time, a really
Yeah.
special time. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I really appreciate what you said about sort of like those feelings of inadequacy. I think one thing I've found, I've done like a handful of written interviews with different theologians and biblical scholars for our Whip and Stock blog, where I'm essentially just asking them sort of very short uh, questions about writing, what it's like to write and publish in the Theological Academy. And it seems like I feel like the biggest like learning point I've gleaned from all that is that it's almost kind of universal to have an experience of imposter syndrome. Like
Mhm.
even people who have published a ton of books still wrestle with that. So and for some reason,
Mhm.
it's helpful to know that people you
Yeah.
really admire and you respect their work, also, have those same struggles. That's helpful for some reason. Did you? But
Absolutely.
one of my questions is that sort of process of keeping your own faith, or having your sort of your uh, the what you described as the kind of the narrow version of faith, that you sort of grew up in, sort of having that challenged. Did did that? I mean, was that fruitful for you in the end? Like, did it kind of open onto like a positive expression of your faith in the end?
Yeah, I think, and I think that's something that's still happening. But
Yeah.
yes, and I completely recognized the possibility that some turn their backs on their faith, and that
Mhm.
very well could have happened, in my life, in my journey. Um, but uh, uh, I guess I would just say, by God's grace, I continue to have a sense that God is real and with me. And then also through God's grace, I've been given so many wonderful friends
Mhm.
who love and accept me, even in the midst of my doubts, even in the midst of my selfishness and sin, and that in and of itself displays to me God and God's love.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
yeah. But and I think that, to get to another aspect of what your question was originally was, I think seeing the particular professors at Duke who are, top-notch theologians and biblical scholars, practitioners, practical theologians, that many of them were authentically practicing Christian faith, and that even as they themselves were raising really challenging questions, they continued to follow Christ. And that gave me a lot of confidence and a sense of freedom to do likewise.
Yeah.
And so, like, some of the people I would especially highlight were, again, Richard Hayes, Warren Smith, Susan Eastman, Ellen Davis, Stanley Hauerwas, Douglas Campbell, Norman Wurzba, and Michael Gorman. And E.P. Sanders was another person who was really influential on my thinking, but not necessarily, the faith sort of formation wise, but,
Yeah.
and especially my doctoral committee, and Susan Eastman was my advisor. And then Ellen, Douglas, and Norman were on my committee. And, they've continued to just give me support and nurturing through the years. So I
Yeah.
think that professors themselves have a lot of power to influence their students, and their students' faith in this process.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, I think like it's so like reassuring in a way when your professors who are brilliant are also seem like good people, and like have like a really living, vibrant faith. I like that. For some reason, that at least for me, like in my experience, when I've had professors like that is really sort of like something I hold on to as like a source of hope, and just something that like sort of helps you hold on to the faith. And yeah, so I mean, you mentioned Susan Eastman, and you actually edited a book with us at Cascade, which we mentioned briefly earlier, Practicing with Paul. You edited that in honor of her. I think it was for a birthday of hers or something, right?
Yeah, her 65th.
Okay, her 65th birthday. Okay. And so in that book, you and all the contributors are sort of exploring what potential impact sort of Pauline studies in the academy might have for the actual concrete life of the church, and also like individuals within the church. So what would you say is kind of one major way Pauline scholarship can contribute to the life of the church today?
So this is like a super generalized level. It doesn't really touch on any particular chapter of that book or contribution, but probably draws upon the various contributions. But basically, I think that Pauline scholarship can help us view Paul. Sorry, my dog wants to play, and so he's kind of growling at me. Go lie
It's
down.
all good.
So it helps us to view Paul and his letters as the truly complex and contextually situated documents that they are. And many scholars will tend to read Paul's letters in relation either to his Jewish tradition, and so, reading Paul in relation to his scriptural heritage and his Jewish context, or in relation to the more so-called secular, but not really secular, the Imperial Greco-Roman context. But really, both of these realities are critical for our greater understanding of Paul and his relationships and his written work. And so I think what Pauline scholarship can help us with is just getting at least a small amount of grasp on those two very deep, expansive fields of study, the Jewish background of Paul and the Greco-Roman background or contexts. it's really hard to, do all of that well. But as we rely on Pauline scholars to inform us about the most salient issues, um, we can come to understand the poignancy of Paul's letters much more fully, and I believe interpret them more accurately, as we see them situated. And the challenge, of course, is that as we dig deeper, we find that the issues are much more complex and often less certain than we'd like them to be. Our introductory texts sort of make it sound like everything's cut and dry and this is the way it is. And yet when we go below the surface, we find, oh, there's actually a lot of debate about this and uncertainty. And we're just piecing probabilities together. And that can be really unsettling, but maybe it teaches us something too, to hold ourselves, hold our own convictions a little bit more loosely, or maybe not convictions, but we maybe just gain a greater sense of humility, perhaps. So I think Pauline scholarship reveals a Paul who's very multifaceted, and this can help us recognize our own complexities and the complexities of those that may really irritate us and with whom we come into conflict, and that, okay, just as Paul had these very conflictual relationships, we too have them. And I think Paul sometimes maybe wasn't as compassionate as he could have been, but we can always learn. And I think that Pauline scholarship can also teach us about how Paul wrote to very particular congregations as they faced very particular struggles and had their own perspectives and pressures, and that those congregations had a different history with Paul than other congregations had with Paul. And so all of that information can just help us appreciate who Paul was as a missionary, as a follower of Christ, and the struggles he faced, and the ways in which he communicated the gospel in ways that would be particularly suited to each congregation and its needs.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I've been working my way very slowly through J. Lewis Martin's commentary on Galatians. And that was one thing that was new to me. Is I'm sort of an infant in terms of my awareness of like biblical studies. I've read a lot more in theology and philosophy, so it was new to me that that there was a real conflict between, or at least this is what Martin argues, that there was a real conflict between Paul and then kind of some of the leaders of the Jerusalem church. Yeah. And so I think that for me it was like, oh, that's kind of surprising. But also it was illuminating for me, because I think it's really easy to hold on to this image of like the early church as being sort of like this like untarnished period where the church was just what it was supposed to be. Like you see this with people sort of interpreting the patristics like this, but you also see it with people like really turning to the New Testament church as the model for the church today.
Right.
But I think that was like illuminating for me that, oh, like conflict has always been a part of the
Yes.
church from the very beginning.
Yeah, it wasn't uniform. And I think, the Hebrew Bible holds really different, very divergent perspectives together in its one, you know, canon of books. And then the New Testament itself, I think that it holds quite different perspectives all together. And, you have a letter like James, and then you have Paul, and I wouldn't say that these are, diametrically opposed, but they are speaking from different places and in some ways in some conflict. And yet
Mm-hmm.
these are all held together in our one, set of scriptures. And does that not teach us something about the breadth of God's kingdom
Yeah.
or reign or
Yeah.
family, however we want to describe
Yeah.
it?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. That's beautiful. Okay, what's kind of one thing you learned while you were editing this book? Because you were a pretty young, like a younger academic while you were editing this collection, and there's a lot of really heavy hitting scholars who contributed. So, did you learn anything about like sort of the nature of academic relationships, academic community, but also did you learn anything about Paul as you were editing this?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, it was a real privilege to get to undertake this project, and it was the idea of it came to me in something like maybe a God moment where I just had this overwhelming sense that I needed to pursue it, and just kept pushing for it, trying to find a publisher who would take it on, because not many publishers are willing to do festschrifts.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But um, it was an interesting thing to try to do at the time when I really probably should have been putting my energies towards revising and publishing my dissertation first.
Right.
But I I don't always do the most practical things. I go with my
Sure.
my ideal or whatever, and so I pursued it. But I think one of the things I learned through the process, working with academics who are very busy, is that they really appreciate, and it's very effective to make clear expectations and timelines early in the process, and you know send reminders, um, provide timely feedback and clear communication, and
Mm-hmm.
at the same time provide some wiggle room and grace as needed. Um,
Yeah.
but I was amazed at how quickly folks got me their chapters, and I mean the whole process went very, very quickly and smoothly. It was
Mm.
it was really amazing. Um, the the real blessing or benefit of the project was that I was able to begin my own relationships with Susan's professional network. That
Yeah. Yeah.
I rode on her coattails to make myself known to, some of the
Yeah.
top Pauline scholars and theologians around. So, um, yeah, that was just a real beautiful thing. And the greatest joy of the project was seeing Susan's deep appreciation for it.
Mm.
Um, and it seems as though the book has also been useful for some folks, and using them in classes and stuff like that. So
Yeah.
I do think that it has some really good entries, and um, I like the idea of making biblical scholarship that much more accessible to practitioners, to people who are going to inhabit the fruits of academic labors.
Yeah. For sure. Yeah. Yeah, it just sounds delightful, like getting to sort of rub shoulders with all these people who are, so top of
Mhm.
their field. Was there like a birthday party or some kind of celebration where you like was this a surprise for Susan or did she know
Yeah.
about it?
So, so to make this happen, I early on actually asked her, who are some of your closest colleagues and friends? Um, and so I basically told her that, hey, I'm gonna be trying to put this together.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
unfortunately, it wasn't a complete surprise. And
sure.
then also, unfortunately, um, I didn't have the money at the time to like host a party for
Yeah,
her
yeah, yeah.
gathering. And so we just the contributors and Susan, we all just kind of gathered at the back of one of the sessions before a session began and hugged her and yeah. So it was
Awesome.
pretty basic, unfortunate in that way, but oh well.
But I'm sure she understood. You were probably like a new, like fresh out of grad school. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm sure she understood. And I mean, it sounds like you were saying that it meant a lot to her though. So,
Yeah.
okay, let's turn to your new book on Romans, which you just published with Cascade a few months ago, Creation, Slavery, and Liberation. Which, yeah, like I said, I got to read a few chapters. It was really, really interesting stuff. And one of the things you write in there, which I'm going to quote a couple sentences, you say, in overlapping the scriptural and ecological lenses, we are enabled to perceive a convergence of Scripture's story of creation and science's story of Earth. They both reveal the importance of non-human vitality. So you're kind of paralleling Scripture's story of creation and science's story of Earth, right? So what are the commonalities and kind of the differences between these two stories?
Hmm. So, traditionally, theology and biblical interpretation will tend to downplay the creative role that the earth seems to play in the generation of life. But I think Genesis 1 in particular, that creation account, clearly indicates that the earth does act as a creative agent. And that idea certainly aligns well with evolutionary science. The difference, which is, of course, a huge difference, but the difference is that the Bible portrays God as initiating, guiding, and supporting Earth's vitality and the generation of living things. Um, so that's at least somewhat of a convergence, though the
Yeah.
difference there is huge. Another convergence is something maybe related to interdependence.
Hmm.
There's quite a number of biblical passages that indicate how human action affects the well-being of non-human creation and vice versa. So people can either promote Earth's fertility and vitality or degrade it. And
Hmm.
again, science confirms this in countless ways. A fundamental difference between a scriptural story of creation and science's story is a matter of telos, the goal. For science, there's no specific end towards which the earth and its inhabitants are spiraling. You know, according to many Christian interpreters, though, scripture tells us that God is directing creation towards peace and renewal and flourishing and justice, liberation, glorification, all of those lovely theological terms. So
Hmm.
this difference of telos um, is gigantic, but it's a real gift, I think, in many ways that Christians have received and then also can offer, because it gives us hope, a hope that God is committed to the well-being and restoration of the earth, and that this commitment of God invites us to get on board, to cultivate those same forms of well-being and restoration that God's moving all of creation towards.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Okay. So then one of the kind of other things, like a next move you sort of make, is putting these two stories in relationship to politics. And sort of an argument you're making. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but is that polities kind of also provide narratives that we live by.
Mm-hmm.
And so I know that this is a huge question I'm about to ask, but I'll just go for it anyways. In your view, like, how do politics kind of figure in Paul's thought? Like, what's sort of the relationship between his gospel and specifically the political realities he and his congregations were living within?
Mm-hmm. So Paul doesn't take on politics sort of explicitly and directly, or political entities specifically and directly. At least those political entities that are outside followers of Jesus. These political impulses show up very subtly, but I do think that Paul did resist some of the political sensibilities and practices and the religious convictions that the empire held forth. And this is because the empire was wanting to inspire people to devote themselves and express faithfulness or fidelity to the emperor throughout the Mediterranean world and within its sphere of influence. And this desire to have people devote themselves to imperial ideology and practice came into conflict with Paul's view of how we should live our lives under the God of Israel and God's Messiah. So, as Paul's inspiring devotion and fidelity to Christ, he's at times guiding his participants to stand, at least in some conflict with the political powers. Though I think that conflict wasn't always really obvious, because Christianity, as it's developing during Paul's day, it isn't something separate from Judaism. At the time, followers of Jesus were within Judaism itself. And Jews had this religious freedom under the Roman Empire. And so as long as the followers of Jesus were able to have the same sort of religious freedoms as their Jewish brothers and sisters, things were generally okay, though, the Christians would be practicing forms of hospitality and truth-telling and things like that would be maybe divergent from common practices among their peers, their non-Christian peers. But so I think that there's a bit of conflict, but it's maybe not extreme conflict between Paul and the politics of the empire. Where I see a particular conflict that I've focused on is in Romans 8:19 through 21, where Paul, it seems to me, is undercutting an imperial narrative about nature or creation. This Bible would call it creation, Roman ideology would call it nature, but Paul Paul is saying that creation is eagerly awaiting the apocalypse of the sons of God. And, that God is, of course, the God of Israel. And this was in contrast to the imperial message that first Augustus and then later Nero, who were proclaimed to be sons of gods, had established the golden age of natural abundance. So Paul is instead saying, no, creation is still suffering. It's subjected to frustration or futility. It's in bondage to decay, as the NRSV says, but I think the better translation is enslaved to destruction.
Hmm.
And in fact, it's waiting for the siblings of Jesus Christ, the resurrected people of God, to appear. That's when it will be liberated. So I think that there's a very subtle anti-imperial narrative going on there, but it's easy for us to miss it
Yeah.
from this vantage point.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, no, that's really, really interesting stuff. Okay, so then as we interpret Paul in today's context, right, as modern readers of Paul, are there resources he offers us as far as the church's engagement with political realities that we're facing today, or even just individual Christians as we sort of face political realities? What kinds of resources, if any, does Paul offer us?
Well, I'll limit my focus here again to more like creation sorts of things, but I think it's interesting that Paul draws upon his observations of creation, kind of takes creation as brings creation in as a witness as he's going through chapter 8 to try to encourage those who are suffering for Christ to maintain their faith and continue forward. He looks to creation and its testimony. I think that's a beautiful example, and that he also very courageously spoke about the injustices and destruction he witnessed. And not as specifically as we would hope, because it would be nice to know exactly what was in his mind. But he definitely is telling us, hey, use your bodies as tools for justice rather than
Mm-hmm.
injustice or wickedness, in chapter 6. And thus, I think that Paul's form of discipleship was not merely spiritual, but really embodied and active, and that discipleship inevitably met with political conflict. And yet he courageously moved forward with that. And so this gospel, I think, offers us hope and encourages us as we pursue justice and flourishing for our human neighbors as well as all creation.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Okay, so then Paul, right? He's a receiver or a reader of the Hebrew Bible, and so much of his work he's sort of interpreting the Hebrew Bible. And so in your book, Creation, Slavery, and Liberation, you're sort of you're to some extent exploring kind of the what he receives from the Hebrew Bible in terms of especially like God, the non-human world, and humanity, and then sort of the relationship between all three of these actors. So what is kind of the theological heritage that he inherits and takes up from the Hebrew Bible in regards to those things specifically?
Mm-hmm. So there's a number of concepts here I think Paul gleaned from the scriptures. One is that creation is an agent and collaborator with God. Another is creation is a witness to God and therefore deserves our attention. Creation is also a witness against humanity and its injustices, sometimes called as a witness to present its case to God. A third main idea is that creation is affected. It's either positively or negatively affected by humans. And Paul likely believed that creation was subjected to frustration and enslaved to destruction, at least in part because of human activity. In Romans 5, he draws upon the Genesis 3 story as he talks about Adam and the entrance of sin and death into the world. And I think that that narrative would have just confirmed for him this idea that human action can have dire effects on creation. And at the same time, as people experience God's liberation and glorification, the rest of creation might also experience at least some liberation from its slavery to destruction. That destructiveness of human action could be minimized or alleviated as people walk in the ways that God leads us to walk. So that's one other point. The fourth main point is that the Messiah is really central to the liberation of creation, as Paul would have learned from the prophets. That's not all the prophets center creation's renewal on a messianic figure. Sometimes it's God's people themselves, but the Messiah, certainly for Paul, was central. And that God's people then are called to walk alongside that Messiah, to cooperate with God's work of liberation.
Yeah, I mean, just as kind of an aside, I'd be really curious what, I know you're a New Testament scholar, but what would be your reading of the, oh gosh, I'm forgetting the Genesis verbiage as far as kind of humanity's, it's like
Dominion?
subduing
Mm-hmm.
dominion. Yes, yeah.
Yeah,
How would you sort of interpret that, or what would kind of be a Pauline
right,
reception of that?
right. So, I definitely think that the wording has led to really very, very destructive forms of practice and theology, and is not just like an innocent sort of text. But when it was written, it was likely written in a time of when Judea was conquered, the peoples were disempowered and humiliated. And I think that the forms of dominion and subduing that the Genesis 1 text expresses is it's humanizing for those people who are conquered and belittled and just and basically told, you were created by the gods to serve the interests of the monarch and the priests, and that's all that you're good for. So I think that, and then that doesn't solve the entirety of the problem. But so the easy, quick answer is that I think that the dominion language, we should interpret it as servant leadership. We have the ability to use our minds, to think, to plan ahead, to create machines. How are we doing this? And are we doing it in ways that cause destruction, or are we doing it in ways that allow for what God created according to Genesis 1 could flourish? So when God says towards the end, or when that passage says towards the end of chapter 1, that God gives humans particular plants to eat and the animals of the field the grasses to eat. Are we ensuring that all living things have access to the food that God has given them in creation? Or
Right.
are we actually undermining all of that diversity
Yeah.
and utility? So, um, yeah, so this is all very complex, but I think important for us. I appreciate you bringing it up because it's a very important, powerful text that has had a lasting influence in some pretty negative ways.
Yeah. I do think that's really, I've not heard that perspective before, but I think it's really helpful what you mentioned about sort of the ancient Israelites being kind of a subjected people, and that this being sort of a proclamation of their agency in regards to
Mhm.
creation. So I think that's kind of a really helpful key, at least for me.
Hmm.
Okay, so then uh, during Paul's day, living in the Roman Empire, were there any sort of major forms of ecological degradation, kind of on behalf of the empire during his time, and then also were there sort of other narratives that the empire was putting forth about sort of the
Mhm.
ecological world or agriculture that would have kind of really held sway in
Mhm.
Paul's social world?
Mhm. Well, I think the primary form of, and the most obvious form of ecological degradation that was taking place was deforestation. The and just to be clear, that ancient peoples and the farmers and the people who were sort of the landed gentry of the time who could write and were educated, they wrote about the correlation between deforestation and erosion of soils. So these people recognized these correlations. It's not just a figment of our imagination that people could have, and Paul could have been aware of these things. Anyways, so
Yeah.
deforestation was huge, and it was taking place at alarming rates around especially major cities because people needed huge amounts of trees for fuel and lumber.
Hmm.
And the empire needed, of course, lots of lumber, but specific kinds of lumber too. The old growth trees that were real tall, so for their ship sails and for ports and all of those sorts of things. So, especially around Ephesus and Miletus, Paul, and then Syrian Antioch, Paul would have seen deforestation at work. Um, Environmental historians have documented the ways in which deforestation and its effects, like erosion and siltation of rivers and waterways, um, all of this was intensified during the height of the early Roman Empire. So between the late first century BCE to into the second century CE.
Mhm.
And the people of Rome themselves would have at least felt the effects of deforestation through the flooding of the Tiber River, which
Okay.
was aggravated by the nude hillsides
Yeah. Yeah.
upriver. Um, and there's some very lowland areas in in the city of Rome where the poor people lived, and those places flooded. There were a number of pretty significant floods that happened during the first century in
Mm.
particular. And these are all very complex issues, and we have to hold them with some level of uncertainty.
Mhm.
And I certainly don't claim that Paul recognized these forms of destruction in the same way as ecologists would today. But I also don't think he was oblivious, because these processes would have had direct effects on the farmers and the artisans and the various people he would have been ministering to.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Okay, so then, yeah, no, that's really interesting and helpful. Yeah, context to know. So then, in your book, you outline what you call eco-ethical principles that we as contemporary believers can draw from Paul's letters to the Romans. So what are some of those? I won't ask you to name all seven unless you really want to, which would be totally fine. But what are some of those principles, and then where are you finding them in Paul's work?
So I'll just raise up a couple. The first is one I've already alluded to, that basically we should attend to creation story by recognizing the ways in which God's creation not only reveals the creator God, but also exposes its own condition on account of the complex, interdependent relationships between and among non-human and human participants. And I find this principle sort of coming to the surface in Romans 1, but also in chapter 8, where Paul turns his attention to creation's condition, its longing, and its future in order to strengthen the hope of the people to whom he writes. So that would be one thing. And then principles, what I call principles 2 and 7, I'm going to sort of smush them together. And they state that we should express gratitude to the great creator God for the gifts of creation, sharing the gifts of food and water with God's creatures. And then exercise appropriate self-restraint in order equitably to share the gifts of creation and support the vitality and fidelity of other members of God's creation. And I think that, and as a side note, these principles are also very much rooted in the Hebrew Bible and what I see as sort of core creational streams of thought in the Hebrew Bible that Paul might have been picking up. Okay. So, but as far as in Paul's own letters, I think there's several passages that bring these sorts of concepts to us. This idea, especially of sharing the gifts of creation with others. So, for example, in Romans 12, Paul exhorts followers of Christ to engage in liturgical service in which they would offer their living bodies as sacrificial gifts to God. And this service demands particular ways of being with others. And these others might even be enemies or so-called enemies, or those who would persecute them. And so for Paul, the Christian love that the followers of Christ are to manifest leads them to extend hospitality to friends and strangers, and also to share food and drink with enemies. So that's kind of huge.
Yeah.
And then in chapter 14, Paul tackles what was probably growing into a pretty volatile situation between and among the various congregations in Rome. So there were different churches, different house churches in Rome. And maybe some were upper class or more wealthy, others were poorer, various mixtures of historically Jewish people, people born into Judaism, and those who were more pagan, Gentile birth. So there's lots of diversity within these congregations and between these congregations. But fundamentally, he expects that when these diverse congregations come together for their mealtime worship services, those who are in power or feel empowered, what he calls the strong, they are probably people who have a sense of liberty, a liberty of conscience with regard to food rules or dietary regulations. Well, Paul calls them to adapt their eating habits so that the people who are disempowered or weak, and have a stricter sense of conscience with regard to dietary regulation, that so that they might participate fully without shame, without fear, or without argumentation. And I think a really poignant statement Paul makes is in 14, verse 15. And my translation of it is, "Do not, by your eating, destroy that one for whom Christ died." So
Mm.
if we were to take that sentiment seriously today, when so much of the food that we consume on a daily basis demands the degradation of soils, the degradation of ecosystems, the mistreatment of human beings, the mistreatment of animals, um, to me, it becomes very clear that we're destroying those for whom Christ died by our
Mm.
eating.
Yeah.
And it maybe not is not their lives, but it's certainly their well-being, their flourishing, their health, of millions of people, and of course millions of beings. Um, an additional sort of facet I take with this is that since in Romans 8, Paul, to me, makes it very clear that Christ's atoning work, his liberation, will lead to non-human creation's liberation.
Mm.
That
Mm-hmm.
Christ did not just die for humans. His death is liberatory for all of creation. It's effective for all of creation. Thus, those for whom Christ died expands beyond the human species.
Yeah.
And that's to and putting this sort of into practice, of course, brings all kinds of questions, difficult questions into view of like, okay, well, can we kill an animal for and eat it?
Right.
Um, but no matter what, our eating will demand the death of something, whether it's
Mm-hmm.
insects or whatever. I mean, it does
Mm-hmm.
involve death. But does it need to involve the destruction that is happening at extraordinary rates around the world
Yeah.
because of industrial agriculture?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. No, and you're already um, moving well into something that you get into in your book as well, which is sort of applying Paul to the food system today, industrial agriculture, especially in America. And I think, yeah, that's something for myself too, that it just seems like such a complex issue. Like there's just so many layers of complicity there, especially with the food system in America. But to sort of like try to disentangle yourself feels like a complex endeavor and one that requires
Mhm.
like a lot of resistance.
Mhm.
um, but what would you say? What would you say? I mean, in terms of Paul, but also just in general as Christians, is sort of our responsibility in our relationships with food. How can we sort of participate in foods in our food system in a way that's sort of more uh, life giving, I guess.
Mhm. Mhm. Well, so I'm going to kind of speak in broad terms here, but generally, industrial agriculture causes unnecessary amounts of destruction to Earth's creatures, the waters, air, soils, and ecosystems. But that doesn't mean that industrial agriculture intends to do this or that it set out to cause this destruction.
Yeah.
Because in fact, wants to do is feed millions of people, billions of people inexpensively, safely, and accessibly.
Mhm.
But when we look at it truthfully and honestly, we find that it fails in each of these points. One aspect of one reason for this is that it's heavily reliant on fossil fuels for tractor power and transportation, but also for fueling the production of synthetic fertilizers. It takes a lot of energy to change, to reconfigure nitrogen, atmospheric nitrogen, into usable nitrogen, nitrogenous chemicals, so for fertilizer,
Right.
fertilizers that we can spray onto our lands. And so this industrial agriculture as this sector of society is a significant contributor to global warming.
Mhm.
So as we tackle, and improve the ways in which we feed ourselves, we are participating in helping reduce global warming, hopefully, if we do it well. And so in addition to the whole fossil fuel global warming piece, is that the fertilizers and pesticides we use actually diminish the health and vitality of the soils, which can be pretty surprising to us because we think, well, this is doing the soils good, but it actually diminishes the soil's the soil ecosystem's inherent ability to maintain fertility over the long haul.
Mhm.
And then, of course, a byproduct of the fertilizers and pesticides is, pollution of water and air, and the killing of unintended insects and birds and so on.
Sure.
Now, the positive thing is that researchers have found that it's so when they compare a huge expansive field or an area of land that is farmed as a monocrop, and compare that to a polyculture that's more intensively and regeneratively farmed, the polyculture is actually more productive. It yields more food than the monocrop.
Mm.
So when people say, well, we can't feed the world apart from industrial agriculture, that's not really true, though it will require some major changes for us to feed ourselves in regenerative ways. Um,
Sure.
it will take more human labor in many respects, and a major change in governmental policies and the ways in which it provides subsidies and support, financial
Mhm.
support to the monocrop commodity crop sales, types of crops. So the whole system really needs revamping, but there is definitely hope and positive options. And I generally name these regenerative forms of agriculture.
Mm.
So I think that Paul's letter and the sort of Christian principles that we glean from it should motivate us towards towards taking a concern for the mundane issues of how we feed ourselves and
Yeah.
how we care for the land, and that we work towards justice and something maybe we could call lifefulness. I often use the word zoopoiesis in the book, coming from the word in Romans 8:11, where the Spirit makes alive.
Mm.
That we're participating in God's work of making creation alive, or supporting its lifefulness, its vitality.
Hmm. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Okay. Well, I want to honor your time, so I'll just give you one more question, and then I can
Sure,
let you
thank
go.
you.
But yeah, kind of as follow up to that one, and sort of zooming in on the micro scale, are there things just sort of in our own personal lives that we can
Mm,
do, or that we can refrain from, that
mm,
would sort of put us in, I don't know, kind of a more like Eucharistic, more grateful, more priestly relationship with
mm,
the food that we consume. Um, yeah, are there sort of practical things that we can do or refrain from?
mhm. So some of the things, uh, one could figure out a way to compost your scraps of food or the peels of food and things like that. Um,
Hmm.
and I have I have found that I was always a little bit nervous about getting red wiggler worms and having a
Yeah,
vermicompost in my house.
sure.
But I happen to have this storage area down beside our garage, so it's not in our living area, and it stays relatively cool in the summer and warm in the winter, so it works well for the worms. But I mean, it's been super simple. I've
Yeah,
been
yeah.
amazed at how simple it is. But anyways, so just thinking about how could our food waste get get put back into the soil,
Yeah,
as food, because that's the natural cycle, rather than interrupting that cycle by sending things to the landfill.
yeah.
Um, and of course, so much food. I mean, food prices are just skyrocketing,
Hmm.
but there are ways in which one can procure sort of more organic or regeneratively grown foods at at least a little bit more economical prices than the
Hmm.
typical grocery store will sell them.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
through food co-ops, um, sometimes I've found places that sell more like bulk foods, like if somebody's in more of a Mennonite or Amish area,
Okay.
sometimes those folks can have access to organically grown oats, for example,
Mm,
or bread flours that you can buy at a price that's much less expensive than Bob's Red Mill or whatever it's called, the
sure,
brand that,
sure. Yeah,
yeah, that's so expensive.
yeah.
Um, and then along with that, trying to eat more beans, like kidney beans, black beans, rather than so much reliance on meat. Just,
Sure.
those small ways, though, to be honest, I get easily discouraged and overwhelmed and think I'm not doing enough, never doing enough. And yet implementing small changes over a period of time, it makes a difference. And then of
Yeah,
course any advocacy that we can do to make large level differences in governmental policies
yeah,
can be huge.
yeah, for sure. No, yeah, for sure. I think, yeah, it can be overwhelming and it can feel like at times like, is this really making a difference? But I think there's also the aspect of the conversion it
Hmm.
makes upon you, like as
Hmm.
you're like the ways that it changes you, and
Hmm.
you're, in the way you're, I don't know, relating creation to God, in sort of a more, I don't know, gentle and life giving way, as we've talked about.
Hmm.
Okay, well, I will let you go, but I do want to say thank you very much for chatting, and it's been a
Hmm.
joy meeting you and getting the chance to talk with you. So thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome. It's been a true pleasure, and I look forward to getting to talk about this with other people who might be interested in talking more. So if folks ever want to get in contact with me, they can find me at presianburroughs.com, my WordPress site. But I love creation, I love scripture, and I enjoy talking about these topics. So thank you for inviting me.